Thank you so much to everyone who's able to join us this afternoon for the second in our webinar series. We're so excited to have you. This is, perhaps as a reminder, a series that's being co-hosted by the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation and the Maritime Washington National Heritage Area. We are able to put on this webinar series through the generosity of Harrison Goodall. If you have had the chance to meet Harrison or work with him or hear about his good works, you know what an absolute force he is in the technical preservation world. So we're so grateful to Harrison for his generosity in supporting this endeavor. I'm going to have a little bit of housekeeping, but first, I'll do some introductions. My name is Moira Nadal. I am the Preservation Programs Director here at the Washington Trust. I'm involved with a number of our programs, so I've met some of you through different capacities, and I have also with me in the same office and on this Zoom, my colleague Alex Gradwell, who will now introduce herself.
Hey guys, my name's Alex Gradwell. I am the program director for the Maritime Washington National Heritage Area here at the Washington Trust. And yeah, excited to be kicking off the second in this series today.
It would be so wonderful if you all could take a moment to introduce yourselves in the meeting chat. We'd love to know your name and who you're here on behalf of. If you're here on behalf of yourself or an organization or agency, we'd love to see that in the chat so you can get a sense of who else is in the audience. We ask that everyone please stay muted because of audio experience. We don't want there to be a lot of background noise or echoes, so please stay muted. You'll have opportunities to ask questions. Jenny will cue us for a Q&A, 5 minutes, about halfway through her presentation, and then we'll have additional time for questions at the end. So if you are like me and you need to write out your question as soon as you think of it, you're welcome to be adding those to the chat. We'll be monitoring them, and I'm happy to help read them out. Sorry for the motorcycle. Happy to help read out the questions at that halfway point or at the end. And if you're not feeling camera shy, we'd love to have you turn on your camera and raise your hand or unmute yourself to ask your question yourself during those designated Q&A times. And this entire session is being recorded, so if you want to refresh her later or you want to share the information that's presented today out, you'll have the opportunity to do so. So as we've already said, this is part 2 in a series, and both the Washington Trust and the Maritime Washington National Heritage Area have been engaging in conversations and trying to take on some leadership in the areas of climate events and their impact on historic properties and communities and resources. And we've done that in a number of ways, one of which is this webinar series, which again, we're so happy to everyone who registered and was able to make it today. We've done that in a few other avenues, including listing the Coopville Wharf as one of the state's most endangered places because of the damage and ongoing threat to the wharf because of king tides. I've been working to develop a subgranting program through a competitive Broom grant that we received from the National Park Service, thanks in part to Alex for writing the grant application, and we'll be opening that in the fall, where we will be able to subgrant out money into rural communities across coastal Washington to help with flood adaptation and mitigation. This webinar and all of these other pieces are going to funnel into a resource guide that we're in the process of developing, and there will be more on that later. So if you weren't able to make it to the first one, just a quick recap of the series. Last week, we learned some very technical and interesting information about how to assess risk and impact with Dr. Ian Miller. Today, we have Jenny Parker from the National Park Service on how do you go about adapting and coming up with your adaptation plan, navigating federal guidance, which can be intimidating but is incredibly useful. After that, we're going to be having a session on how do you get the permits. So you understand what the risk is to your property, you figure out a smart way to go about adapting to it, compatibly making changes to it, And then how do you do that in a legal way? How do you know what kind of permits or permissions or reviews and approvals you might need? Will help you to figure out how to navigate that. And then the final webinar in the series will be about assembling your team. So you've got everything in place. Do you know when to hire an architect versus an engineer versus a landscape architect? How do you figure out who is going to be the best grouping of people that sets you and your project up for success? So hopefully all of these work in a series to get everyone up and ready for navigating these processes. But today, as I mentioned, we are so lucky to have Jenny Parker with us. Um, in spring of 2024, Jenny became the program manager for the Heritage Adaptation and Resilience Program with the National Park Service. She previously has 17 years of experience with the National Park Service, where she has reviewed applications for the Federal Historic Preservation Tax Credit Program. She's developed guidance related to the Secretary of the Interior's standards, like, and you'll see more about this, guidelines on flood adaptation and rehabilitation for historic buildings. In her current role, Jenny is coordinating and leading projects to develop frameworks, resources, and guidance related to the stewardship of cultural resources with vulnerabilities to natural disasters and climate change. You can see why we are so lucky to have Jenny as the absolute perfect speaker for today's session. She is also the Chief Appeals Officer for the Historic Preservation Tax Credit. So I'm sure there are many other accolades that she has to her name, but I'll leave it there and stop sharing my slides, and I'll pass it over to you, Jenny, for your presentation.
Great. Thank you, Moira and Alex. Let me just get my screen share going here. All right, so hopefully everyone is seeing that. Alex or Moira, if one of you could just give me a verbal yes or no, that
Yes,
would be helpful.
looks perfect.
Excellent. Okay, then we will jump right in. So guys, today I will be talking mostly about using the Park Service guidelines on flood adaptation for historic buildings. Alex is going to drop a link in the chat, a direct link if you want to be able to access a PDF copy of that. My presentation is going to be broken into two parts. The first part, I wanted to kind of set the context, talk a little bit about assessing risk. I don't think I'll be duplicating anything you might have heard in the first presentation, but if I do, apologies for that. But this is going to be very site specific and kind of leading to adaptation selection. And then what I and my colleagues here in the building kind of talk about, which is drawing the line. And that will become clear as we go through the first part of this presentation. And at the conclusion of part one, again, we'll have some time for questions before we move on into the adaptations themselves and some evaluation. But to give a little bit of a framework around the context, I do want to just mention that when it comes to dealing with the topic of flooding, we have a lot of different levels of government involved. It's really a multifaceted approach where federal, state, and local governments all play a role. And you'll see that in this context, we framed out that there is a process within emergency management systems that different government levels take a role, but also within the historic preservation side, we have our own roles within that. So in the blue, kind of the top bullet for each of those is the emergency management standpoint. And then from the preservation side, we've kind of highlighted where you may have intersections with historic preservation in any sort of a regulatory or even just advisory capacity. And that's true on both sides of the house. So when we're talking about adaptations, we really have to understand the different threats that are, well, threatening our historic resources. And that is something that we've classified into three different categories. From the natural world, we all know that flooding is getting worse and it's impacting more and more properties. And even though this is not new, flooding has been part of our lives and part of our ancestors' lives back to the beginning, but it is becoming more of a problem due to sea level rise and changing rainfall amounts and the changing intensity that we're seeing in different parts of the country. I know that you guys in Washington have seen a lot of atmospheric rivers come through your part of the country. So that's really leading us to need this additional guidance that we've developed over the past decade. And then I just want to mention that from the natural standpoint as well, water infiltration into any building is always a leading cause of deterioration or damage. It can cause dangerous mold growth, and it really creates the right conditions for an unhealthy interior environment. Now, in terms of economics, property owners are also seeing real impacts to their pocketbooks. There have been significant rate increases for flood insurance. In some coastal communities, there's some recognition that certain parts of these communities may not survive longer than another 1 or 2 mortgage cycle. So that could have a really drastic impact on a future tax base, depending on the size of the community that we're talking about. And then recovery and repair after major flooding events is very expensive at every level of our society, from local governments needing to fund municipal cleanup to states and the federal government who also step in and help out. It's a very costly undertaking if we allow our properties to continually be damaged pretty severely and then repaired. So the more resilience we can build in, the better it is for our economics. And then finally, on the political side, it in that sense, what we're talking about is how we as communities on each of these levels, federal, state, and local, deal with flooding. And it's whether we're talking about pre or post disaster. There are a lot of people throughout the country who are trying to find solutions that will save lives. That's always, the first priority, but also we want to save property and reduce the costs associated with flood damage. Um, those frameworks that are being developed don't always factor in all of the values of communities and really hold their sense of place that are embodied in our historic buildings and districts up to the same level, or maybe not same level, but in the priority list of those frameworks being developed. So with all of those kind of factors involved, that's where we in the Park Service decided it would be helpful if we stepped in and tried to provide some guidance and tools so that communities and individual property owners had some language and had some support to try and start inserting historic preservation values into their flood planning and flood resilience designs as they go forward. So just in case anyone is newer to the preservation language, I did want to very quickly remind you, if you already know, or kind of give you a quick introduction, that the world I'm coming from in the Park Service is related to the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. And those standards are contained within 4 different treatments that you can see kind of listed out on the screen. We have preservation, which is all about the stabilization and repair without any major alterations involved. Restoration is where you're returning a building or a property to a significant date and time and kind of freeze it in place for some sort of interpretive purpose. Reconstruction is about rebuilding a property based on any remaining physical or documentary evidence that we may have, and that can be a powerful tool for post-disaster recovery. If you lost a really iconic piece of your community, you might choose to reconstruct it. And then the piece that we're going to be talking about the most today is rehabilitation. And that approach is the most flexible option. It's the philosophy that we can adapt our historic buildings and update them for modern use while we keep the historic character. So if you want to learn more about any of those, there's lots of information on the web. But just so that you're aware, those are the 4 options, and we're going to be focused on rehabilitation today. So a little bit more context from the preservation kind of nitty-gritty world. I mentioned the Secretary of Standards on the last slide, and those really are brief statements that some of us refer to as really kind of setting the rules. They're aimed at the 10,000 foot level. They're very broad. And then they can sometimes be a little bit difficult to apply because they are so broad. So to help out with that, several decades ago, we developed guidelines that interpret those broad standards and bring them down to kind of a bird's eye level. So it's really translating what did we mean by these broad, just like single sentences or just 2 sentences statements that are contained within the standards. How does that actually apply when you get to an actual project? That's what the guidelines do. And then we have some other publications that dive even deeper into specific materials or features and give more technical advice on almost leading into the how to do things. So all of these publications work together to provide guidance on how to meet the standards. But I just wanted you to be aware of kind of where in this hierarchy we are when we're talking about guidelines, because on the local level, guidelines are often regulatory, but in the federal sense, the guidelines are not. They are simply advisory. So the flood adaptation guidelines are a set that are kind of topic specific, and they fit within a family of other guidelines. And if you happen to be familiar with some of the other just general guidelines that we have published, and you start really getting into the flood guidelines themselves, you're going to realize that this set of guidelines is unlike any other that we have ever published. We have treatments within these guidelines that you would never see approved or recommended as meeting the standards in any other circumstances. And the reason for that comes back to the risk associated with flooding. Unlike other issues that we deal with in preservation, things like if you think of urban renewal from the 1960s or, various types of codes and code updates that happen, it's not possible when you're talking about a natural disaster to sit down with kind of your counterpart and negotiate and talk through the issues to develop some sort of compromise solution that would be a win-win. So because flooding is such an existential threat to the existence of our resources, we did have to push a little further and decide that we could accept more change in the face of such insurmountable risk in some places. I would also like to say that for these guidelines, in a lot of books, it's really tempting to flip right past all the introductions and get right to the heart of the guidance or the book that you're reading or whatever it may be. But for the flood adaptation guidelines, it really is necessary to read the introductions. There's 3 or 4 of them. I don't even remember at this point. But they explain the process and the steps that are necessary to access the guidelines and to reach an appropriate treatment decision. So if you're going to sit down and really start to use the guidelines, please read the introductions. But that is some of the material that we'll be talking about in more depth today during this webinar. So the first thing to be aware of, or another thing to be aware of, we're a little bit into the talk at this point, is that to use the flood guidelines, there has to be a flood risk that can be documented at the particular site where you're considering an adaptation. So you need to really, in order to do that, make sure you understand and identify the flood characteristics that are in place at that particular site. And you also have to understand the property characteristics. You will find that different or alternative treatments again, can be found accessible or acceptable, excuse me. And again, because we're under this potential threat to a property, we are willing to accept more change than we would in your typical just straight historic preservation project. So let's talk about assessing your risk and selecting treatment. So one thing to be aware of is that you need to do the best you can to understand what the future conditions at your site are going to be. And we understand that this is always going to have some element of guesswork to it. In many cases, we're talking about very highly educated guesswork, but there's still some level of uncertainty. Future conditions might have a broad range depending on our current use of certain materials or the way that our community is choosing to adapt on a larger scale can have an implication for specific sites. So for those kinds of reasons, your predictions or your guesswork for like the next 5 to 10 years are going to be more reliable than your predictions or your kind of future condition expectations when you start looking out 50 years into the future or 100 years into the future. So keeping that in mind with any project as you're starting to plan, it's important to identify a time horizon for the adaptation project that you're planning. And that should be a conscious and logical choice. Let me give you an example. So a project that's focused purely on building systems, something like HVAC, that would not need to look as far into the future as you need to look when you're considering significant structural improvements. And that's just due to the different service life expectations that we have for those two different systems. We expect structural changes to last through, 50, 100 years, hopefully as far into the future as we can get. An HVAC system, if you're lucky, that's going to last you a good 20, 25 years. I'm probably even pushing it there. But it's a very different calculus at that point. So some other factors that you're going to need to take into consideration are the frequency, direction, timing, and intensity related to the flood. And so all of that relates back to what type of flooding you're expecting at a particular site. And next slide, we'll kind of get into the different types that you can, that may be at play. But the final piece I want to mention before we leave this slide is that you also have to take into account the capacity of the site owner or manager. So you have to think about what resources you have available, what time, what manpower, what kind of funding do you have? All of those kind of questions are obviously going to have a major impact on what your final choice and your final selection for an adaptation treatment is going to be. So I have a short 3-minute video I'm going to share about the different flood types. And while you're watching, pay attention to the different kind of characteristics that you hear about each one. And in particular, one of the key ingredients that will come up over and over when you're looking at different adaptations is whether or not you have warning time. So different floods will give you time to prepare, like if you need to actively go out and deploy a system versus you need something that's in place for a flood that you have no warning for, maybe a flash flood kind of thing. So I will be quiet for a few minutes and let you watch the video.
Flash floods occur with little warning time, developing over minutes or hours, often due to heavy precipitation or the failure of a dam or levee. Floodwaters in these situations generally are fast-moving and often carry debris such as logs, boulders, fuel tanks, or even cars in extreme cases. Flash floods are generally associated with a waterway, but it could be a minor stream or creek that is barely noted or completely dry at other times. Surface floods, also called urban floods, can occur in any developed area. This type of flooding is most often caused by intense rainfall that overwhelms a storm sewer system, causing water to overflow into roads and buildings. Areas damaged by wildfires are especially susceptible to surface flooding because of the changes to the soil caused by fire and the loss of vegetation that would ordinarily help absorb the rainfall. There's generally little warning time associated with surface floods. Riverine floods, also called overbank floods, happen because of snowmelt, ice jams, or heavy and/or prolonged periods of rain feeding a river or stream. The waterway reaches capacity and the excess water spills into the surrounding areas. In areas with wide, flat terrain along a riverbank, floodwater may rise gradually with little velocity. But in steeper areas, floodwater can rise quickly, moving with speed and carrying debris. Some riverine floods are predicted several days in advance, with meteorologists referring to a river reaching a flood stage, often along with a prediction for when the flood will crest. Riverine flooding may also cause channel migration or bank erosion, which can contribute to or exacerbate flood impacts. Coastal flooding occurs along the coastlines of large bodies of water, including the Great Lakes and tidal bays and rivers. Extreme high tides, sometimes called king tides, can send water farther inland occasionally, sometimes coming up through storm water sewers. This type of flooding usually results in a few inches of water in the lowest lying land areas. Where sea levels are rising, occasional extreme high tides transition into floodings from more regular high tides. These events are often referred to as sunny day or nuisance flooding, which will become increasingly frequent in many coastal locations. Storm surge results from the winds of a storm, like a hurricane or typhoon, pushing water on shore. Depending on the magnitude and characteristics of the storm, this can result in fast-moving floodwaters with the added force of waves acting on any structure in the path of the flood. Flooding associated with both high tides and with storm surges are predicted several hours, if not days, in advance of inundation.
Okay, so hopefully you recognize the type of flooding that is typical, at your site. So if you have one in mind, hopefully one of those descriptions resonated with you and you can keep that in mind. So I'm sure you talked about this in the last presentation, but one of the things that you have to make sure you have in place and understand before you get to the point of selecting your adaptation is understanding your risk. So the first place to start to understand your risk is often going to be some form of a map. Here I have two maps for the same location in San Francisco, just demonstrating that you can get different information and might find a different level of risk identified from one map to another. So it might take you a little bit of additional research to figure out exactly which set of characteristics and sort of predictions and expectations for future flooding is the right one for you to go with. There will be a judgment call at a certain point. But the piece that I think is really important for us to dig in on a little bit here today is understanding the depth of your floodwater. So this slide has a lot of information on it, and we're going to spend a little time here to make sure that hopefully folks understand this concept before we move on. So maps are very useful to identify the areas that are going to flood. But the depth of the floodwater is the most important factor in understanding the risks to your specific property. So really trying to understand what parts of the building may or may not be sensitive to the flooding. So there are several terms that are used to talk about the depth of the flood water. And it's important to kind of understand what each one means. So base flood elevation, or BFE, may be a familiar term to you. This is a level that's established by FEMA and the National Flood Insurance Program through flood insurance rate maps. And it is a regulatory term in the sense that buildings are evaluated against this BFE level for compliance or non-compliance with floodplain or flood insurance requirements. So BFE is probably a term that your local governments are using to talk about flooding and what may or may not be in compliance with your local ordinances. A design flood elevation, or the DFE, is often used in the architectural and engineering fields. Now, this is a level that will be established by project teams who are designing an adaptation. And it could be the exact same as base flood elevation, but generally it's higher. You may have heard a term freeboard used in association with base flood elevation. That is a common term used to describe a community's choice or an individual property owner's choice to escalate or just add a certain amount of space between the minimum code compliance, which is base flood elevation, and what they have determined is a more responsive or safe level to plan to. So it's kind of recognizing that the regulatory level isn't always updated on the sort of cycle that responds to the known risk. And there are some other issues around base flood elevation that we won't get into today, but just know that those are two different terms and have two different connotations. So if this space wasn't already complicated enough, we felt compelled as we were writing the flood adaptation guidelines to create even a third term. And I'm sorry about that, but we really felt like there was no way around it. So we created the term established flood risk level. And the reason that we created it was we felt like we needed some terminology to refer specifically to the actual risk that you've determined at that site. It may not be the same as BFE, it may not be the same as what you want to design to, but it should describe the property specific height of the anticipated floodwater. So that is determined by whoever your project team is. The idea is that the established flood risk level, or the EFRL, is something that you would include in your documentation and kind of the showing your work, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But the other thing to be aware of is that all of these heights are not relative to ground level. That's something that if you're just getting into this issue can be really confusing. But all of these levels, if you find a reference to what the base flood elevation is for the property that you have in mind that needs some greater resilience, you might react in a way that's maybe not relative to what the reality is. It's not uncommon to see base flood elevations of, 9, 10, 11 feet. But in reality, when you compare that to where they're measuring from, it may only be a foot above grade. So what all of these levels are measuring against is a vertical datum. And there's, again, more than one, so we're complicating everybody's life here. One that is very commonly used for base flood elevation is the NAVD 88. It's the North American Vertical Datum. 88 refers to the year that it was established. But in common nomenclature, what we're talking about is sea level. It's, when you hear someone talk about, oh, a mountain is this many feet above sea level, obviously sea level changes. We have tides coming in and out. So sea level is not constant, but these vertical datums are constant. So please keep in mind that when we're talking about any of these levels, any of these depths of floodwater, they're measured from not the ground, but from the vertical datum. Okay. Hopefully I've hit that hard enough and everyone's on the same page. If not, feel free to throw some questions at me when we get to the break here in just a couple of minutes. All right, so let's walk through an example real quickly to kind of illustrate this point. This is a historic house, happens to be in Rhode Island, and it was first developed around 1725. It's very early. You can see on the map on the right edge of the screen, it's located pretty close to the harbor, but not immediately on the water. It's a little bit misleading because this is an area that was infilled and developed over time. The house actually was very close to the water, much closer than it is now, but that land was filled in over time to create more area for development. So in the graphic on the left, what you're looking at is a representation of the base flood elevation, which happens to coincide. It's the level that represents a 1% annual chance flood, which at this site is equal to 9 feet 6 inches. So again, 9 feet 6 inches is not 9 feet 6 inches above the ground level. It's referring to that vertical datum line. So when you measure that out, it ends up coming to a spot that's, I have it marked on the photo there with a blue dashed line. In the door on the right-hand side of the photo, you're about, 1/3 up in the glazed portion of that door. So that's your typical risk based on what the base flood elevation information is giving us for this site. Now, we also wanted to think about future predictions for the area. So in a place that's so close to a harbor, sea level rise is a definite factor at this site. And the 3 graphics that you see at the bottom of the screen show us 3 different points in time. At left, we see the high tide level for 2016, and at this point, we're almost 10 years ago, but that's when this project was doing their study, and they have graciously allowed us to use their graphics. So 2016 on the left, which just consider that today, even though it's not. 2050 is in the middle, and then 2100 is on the right. And between those 3 points in time, so now we're seeing no additional elevation above our current high tides. In 2050, we're looking at an increase of 1 feet 9 inches beyond our current levels. And by 2100, we're looking at a real possibility of 6 feet 5 inches of increase for our high tide level. So when we put all this together, we end up with basically doing some addition of our 1% annual chance flood level added onto those increases in sea level rise. And it gives us 3 different time horizons for our potential risk. So if you're planning a project and the pieces and parts of that project have a relatively short service life, then you can probably get away with just planning to your current conditions or maybe to the 2050 conditions. But if you're starting to get into, again, those structural changes that you're wanting to have a life throughout however long we can manage to preserve this site, you might really start looking at what are the risks going to look like in 2100. So this is how you can add up your different risks in one very simple example and get to an established flood risk level. So again, if I gave you this site, a downtown building, fairly typical wood frame house, row house, and I told you that the established flood risk level was 6 feet. I'm guessing that you're all scratching your heads and thinking, well, Jenny, that's not enough information. You already explained to me that 6 feet does not mean that we're talking about 6 feet above grade. And if that was your thought, you are right with me. If you just know the raw number, it doesn't help you plan against the adaptation that you need to do. It's a first step, but you need to take yet another step to place those numbers in the real world and be able to compare what the risk is to the building that you have. So the way that we do that, a really common way, is by hiring a surveyor to come out and complete an elevation certificate for the building. Now, elevation certificates are part of the flood insurance process. They do have some regulatory implications. You don't always have to go for an elevation certificate just to get the information that you're looking for, but a survey team is a great route to go that's generally pretty affordable to find out the information you need. What they can provide if you go with the elevation certificate is that form already has it all laid out so that the surveyor will come back to you with what your base flood elevation is at that site. It will reference the existing flood insurance rate map with the effective date of that map and what flood zone you're in. It will also identify if your site happens to be in a protected area. For instance, if there's a levee between you and the flood source, this certificate will identify that. The surveyors will give that to you. And then it also provides some basic information about the building and the property that helps you in the next step identify what is the part of the property that's most at risk. What kind of impacts can you expect based on the flood insurance rate map? So sorry about flipping ahead too soon. But some of those pieces of information that the elevation certificate will give you is the first floor elevation. And this is really critical. You're going to want to know what height your first floor is in comparison to that established flood risk level. Another critical piece is the lowest opening, like a basement window or a vent, anything that could let water start getting inside the building. It'll also look at your equipment on the site. Do you have an air conditioning unit or a furnace or something like that in the basement or on the ground outside outside your building? This elevation certificate will give you all of that information. And according to just some very quick web research that I did, at least on a national scale, the cost of these certificates can range from, like $600, $700 up to $2,000, $2,500. So yes, it's an expense. If you're, a private property, single family home, it can be a hit on the pocketbook, but it's not out of the realm of what's reasonable for a typical property owner, especially when it gives you such valuable information. I will say that it's not the only way to get this information. There are some other low-tech ways, like if you have a good topographical map that gives you some geographic elevations that you could compare. The problem with that is you have to make sure that the topo map uses the same vertical datum as what the flood information is given in. So just a caveat there. So once you have all of that information, you can get to the point where you can identify and draw the line, which again, this is a term that we've started using just for our own shorthand within our building to refer to that line, that height of floodwater, that level of risk. You can draw it on a photograph. You can draw it across the building to understand how high you expect those floodwaters to go. And then that tells you which parts of the building and site are most at risk to damage. Once you understand how high the flood is expected to be, you can start analyzing the existing property to see if you have any existing capacity to sustain and recover from the predicted flood event. Whether the property is in good condition or poor condition will matter greatly. Just good maintenance can go a long way. And then you can also start to think about what are the implications for the use of that property. You know, if you're using the property as a residence, if people regularly sleep there, then we're going to want to have a higher threshold of safety for any sort of unexpected flood. If it's a museum, we want to think about how protected are the interior spaces, are the objects within that building. So once you have all of that information, you can really start to understand how sensitive the building and the property is to the impacts of the specific flood that you expect at that site, and have a really good sense of how vulnerable it is to interrupted use and damage from a potential flood. And once you've figured that part out, it's really important that you document your conclusions. I like to refer to this as very similar to learning long division in school. So the final answer doesn't count unless you show your work. You really need to write it down because at some point you're going to need to talk to some other people about it and share how you came to your conclusions, whether you're getting into a permitting process or just talking to your neighbors to explain what you're about to do. You're going to want to have it written down and documented so that when you move forward, everybody is on the same page of understanding what context you're making your decisions in. So that concludes the first part of the presentation. I think I went hopefully not too long, but I think we can stop for about 5 minutes and take some questions.
Never too long when the content is so important. Does anyone have any questions? Please, again, feel free to put them into the chat or use the raise hand function. Or if you can't figure that out, just come off mute and let us know what you're getting stuck on. I can come up with a question if we need to let things marinate for another minute. Oh, okay, we've got somebody in the chat. Jenny, a question from Matt. Are typical surveyors qualified to provide certified elevation certificates, or would you need to seek someone out who's got a specialization?
So I think as with anything, when you're hiring somebody, it's important to, check into, have you done this type of work before? A typical surveyor would definitely have the tools to be able to do it. Whether or not they've actually done it or not, that's certainly something I would check into. Just ask if they have the experience doing elevation certificates, but they would certainly have the knowledge and equipment to be able to do one.
And a question from me. If someone was feeling especially intrepid and wanted to try the DIY method that you mentioned with the topo map, how would they, maybe this is a silly one, but how would they verify that the same vertical datum is being used? Do you have advice on that?
So my advice on that is the map should tell you, or it should refer to a benchmark of where they started, and then it may take some research, basically. But whatever topo map is being used, there should be some key or reference to help you be able to trace back to figure it out. Some will probably be easier than others. For instance, if you have a USGS map, those usually have great keyed information that will include information to tell you which vertical datum that it references. If you're using a topo map that like a civil engineer developed for that site specific to, another project that had previously been done, that might take a little bit more work to kind of trace back. But in that case, it may be, a professional in your community that you can simply ask and say, hey, I'm trying to use this for another purpose. Can you tell me which vertical datum this topo map is in reference to, or this site plan that you put together is in reference to? So yeah, it definitely can take a little bit more work to track down, but again, it is a DIY option.
Yeah. I suspect based on every civil engineer I've ever met that they would be so thrilled to have someone ask them that question about their data sources. I'm sure
Right.
they would be happy to tell you.
Yeah.
So we have just a couple more minutes set aside for questions, and I've thought of another while people are developing theirs, unless I'm cutting a new one off, but I don't see anybody trying to come off mute.
Okay.
So when you talk about drawing the line, right? So you looked at your the different kinds of lines that might be for the 2016 today, and then the 2050, and then the 2100. And when
Mm-hmm.
you showed us the blue dashed line on the property in Newport, is that the today line or is that the future line? Because I was starting to feel a little bit confused, and maybe I'm the only one, but maybe not.
So the line, like on this slide that I've come back to, this is the today line.
Okay,
This is based on the 1% annual chance flood for this property based on the high tides as they are today. Yeah.
got it.
And again, I think the point is that there are multiple lines that could be drawn on this property, and each one has a basis in reality. So it's not like we should probably say draw a line.
Mhm.
There's not a single right answer.
Right.
Um, and I know we all hate that, right? But there's not a single right answer.
Right, but this is the today line, and just with the caveat that if you were planning for your foundation or something that's not your HVAC or systems or a basement
Right.
flood, you would be probably looking at a higher line than this. I think
Correct.
the lines
For
are
this
often
property,
higher
you
than
would
people think.
be. Yeah, so if we go back to this slide, you can see on the bottom, these graphics, again, they're older, so they've gotten pixelated, but the middle graphic, you can see you're almost to the top of the door frames, the
Mhm.
door frame on that smaller addition to the building, and then 2100, it's all the way up to the roof level of that addition. So yeah, it would be considerably higher.
Okay. Well, Alex has let me know that I've eaten up everyone's time, and I hope that I didn't cut off other people from asking questions. Don't feel shy. But maybe we can keep moving forward and people can put them in the chat or save them up for our Q&A session at the end of the second half of your presentation.
Perfect.
All right, thank you so much.
All right, we'll keep going. So part 2, we're going to really dive into the adaptation options and talk more about selecting specific treatments and how to analyze from the preservation perspective. So within the guidelines, we have a lot of different adaptation treatments that we describe. They're all listed here. I am not going to go through each one individually because that would be its own 90-minute webinar if we got into the details of each one. But we have kind of grouped them into categories that I'll go through in a little bit more detail. So the first category, as the name on the slide suggests, is that the goal of this group is to keep water out of the structure or to hold it off the envelope of the building. So these treatments can include temporary measures, barriers like sandbags or inflatable bladders, some temporary fencing or walls. It can also include long-term permanent infrastructure like a flood wall or a levee or a dike. Now, at the building level, the goal in this category is to keep the interior dry. So we can see something like dry floodproofing, where we're waterproofing the building envelope, closing off either permanently or temporarily our building openings. And if we decide to go with this kind of at the building envelope fortification, it can require some structural improvements in order to withstand the flood dynamics. The preservation concerns vary greatly. There's a lot of variety in this category, as you can see, where there's much less concern for temporary treatments, up to some very challenging preservation issues around properties that require significant alteration to dry flood proof. And of course, we have landscape and setting concerns with some of the landscape elements. So that's kind of the overview of that category. Moving on to the next category, we have, instead of holding water off of a site or a structure, the design of these treatments is intended to allow water to move through the site or anticipate that the water is going to enter the property. So what we're talking about here really is wet flood proofing, which is really addressing the water moving in and out of the property. By doing this type of work, you're designing the building to minimize the damage. So in concert with some more resilient finishes within the building, you may also pair that with elevating the interior floors, or you might decide to abandon the first floor of a building altogether, which either of those two options would require some considered study and design, but they can allow for water to enter and exit a structure in a controlled and much less destructive manner. So these spaces that are designed to be wet can be created with sacrificial finishes. You might need to think about using these spaces with limited use in mind. And again, the use of interior platforms to keep some parts of the interior of these spaces dry. And one thing to keep in mind with any of these options is that the treatment will always require some level of cleanup and drying out after a flood. So they're generally not optimal for spaces that have historic features and finishes that can be damaged by floodwaters. But if you have an already damaged building, and you're coming back post-disaster, this is a choice that particularly a lot of commercial buildings decide to take. Another category, and these are actually the most common treatments that are used the most for residential structures, just given various incentives that exist out there from the world of kind of the flood insurance world and the flood ordinance compliance world. So they largely stem from FEMA preference, because the goal of this category of treatments is to avoid the impacts from floods altogether by removing either the entire structure or part of the structure from the floodplain. So this can be done by increasing a building's finished floor height or elevation, which if you're only getting flooding in a basement, if you fill the basement, then that kind of eliminates or deals successfully, if planned correctly, with that issue. You can elevate a building on a higher foundation, or you can simply move the building out of the flood risk. And I will say that, each of these comes with fairly significant preservation concerns, or at least the elevating and the relocation do. If you go really high, particularly with elevating a building, you may create a very noticeable visible alteration, which can significantly impact historic character and appearance on the site. But again, these are very common treatments, and we'll kind of step through one of those examples a little bit later. I also want to mention that particularly with moving a building, that's one of those treatments that in the regular world of preservation, again, both elevation and moving, really, they're not recommended preservation practice. And we only consider it acceptable within the flood guidelines because of that flood risk. So for moving in particular, we really only recommend it in locations that are likely to flood repeatedly, those that are subject to pretty significant erosion, or those that are likely to be permanently inundated at some point in time. And I do want to just mention, for those of you who are interested in the grant program that the Washington Trust will be operating in the fall, relocation is not an option, I believe, for that grant program, but you should double check to make sure I've got that right. The final category in the types of adaptations are the unconventional adaptations, and we called them unconventional, not anybody else. And we did that just because they're not currently recognized by FEMA and the flood insurance program in the same way that the other treatments that we discuss are. Many of these are in the prototype testing phase or need some additional application to really fully understand their potential and potential consequences. So this can include amphibious design, which is applying a buoyant foundation to a building so that it floats on top of the floodwaters. There are hydraulic lift systems that have been designed for the floodwater itself, the pressure of the water to lift the building out of harm's way. And there are any number of innovative large-scale landscape flood protection kind of projects that have kind of kicked off over the last 15 to 20 years. These can be very complex engineered systems and networks that reestablish natural systems in conjunction with some engineered systems. So when you're looking at landscape scale, things can get very creative and really interesting. But again, that's not usually happening at an individual historic property. So when you have that kind of menu of adaptation treatments in front of you, what we recommend for helping to narrow down which ones you're considering is to apply 3 factors to your decision making. And you can see that kind of referenced here in the Venn diagram on the screen. Our goals with all of this are to reduce the flood risk, maintain historic character, and choose a feasible and affordable option that can actually be implemented and maintained. And that feasible and affordable option, sometimes we don't do a great job in preservation of keeping that in mind, but particularly when we're talking about flood risk, you can have the best adaptation plan in the world, but if you're not able to actually implement it, the building is not safer. We have not done our job to preserve that building. So it is really key when we're in this arena to make sure that we keep that in mind. So going through each of these criteria a little bit, want to talk about some questions that you can ask yourself as you're evaluating the different adaptation options. So when we're talking about reducing flood risk, want to know if the treatment will sufficiently reduce the risk of damage caused by the flood that you expect. Again, you've got to decide on that time horizon. How far into the future are you gaining protection? And then selecting the time frame really can be informed by all manner of factors. We've talked about using your project itself to help decide. You can also, use the length of time that you plan to manage or own that site. There are also other factors that you can include in trying to select that time frame, but do have one in mind as you're making your plans. For maintaining the historic character, what we're really talking about here is applying the Secretary of the Interior standards and analyzing what impact the treatments will have on the historic character of the property. So we kind of go through this series of questions. Can the treatment be implemented without visible changes? If that's not possible, then would it be possible to match the appearance? If the appearance can't be matched, is there a compatible solution? And then also helpful to consider viable treatments in the context of the overall neighborhood or community. In some places that developed along waterways, there may be local traditions to address a threat. So choosing something that's in the vocabulary of the neighborhood where the building exists may be a really easy way to both maintain your historic character and the historic traditions that are inherent within that district or neighborhood. And then when it comes to feasibility and affordable, of course, you have to consider technical feasibility. And we have included in the guidelines some technical limitations for each of the adaptation treatments to help give you a hint about what may or may not be technically feasible for a particular site. It's also important to think about where you have available funding to implement the preferred treatment. These treatments run the gamut of how expensive they are to implement. So really thinking through what's available and what you have to spend may be one of the most important factors as you consider all of these options. And then it's also really important to engage with your community and any stakeholders that you have to understand, is the local jurisdiction planning some sort of a community-wide intervention? What are your local authorities doing to respond to the risk of flooding? And is there a point in the future where occupation of that site will not be viable or it won't be supported by the local infrastructure? In some communities, particularly in areas where there is repeated cycle of flooding and damage from flooding, communities may identify a buyout zone where they are actively trying to turn some section of the community into more resilient green space that can absorb the floodwaters and avoid damage to buildings. So if your building happens to be in one of those areas that they're identifying a buyout zone, you need to think really long and hard about, okay, if my community has decided they're not going to support habitation at this site, what kind of risk would I personally be taking on if I fought against it? Okay, so we're going to look at a real example here. And I'm sorry this isn't in your part of the world, but hopefully it'll still give you what you need. I want to take a look at this building from the context of applying the information that you will find in the guidelines. Here we have a Creole cottage that was built around 1890. It's located in Mandeville, Louisiana, which, if you're not familiar with Louisiana, this is a community that's on the north side of Lake Pontchartrain. So it's across the water, across the bay from New Orleans. And I'm guessing a lot of people on this call may remember the impacts from Hurricane Katrina. The reason that we have this example and so many others is because, we're approaching within even just a few days the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. So we have a lot of real life examples that have stood some of the test of time and got in pretty early before we had these guidelines and before there was a lot of thought put into, I should say a lot of thought on the national level. There had already been a lot of thought on local levels. But before we had kind of a national framework in place or a lot of tools to support communities that they just had to do it on their own. So we're looking at one of those early examples who kind of were blazing the path, and we have the advantage of looking back on it and making some decisions based on their test case. So in this test case, they had a flood risk in what's known as a velocity zone. So you might have talked about this in the last presentation a week ago, but a velocity zone is where we can expect wave impacts from a flood event. And at this location, we were expecting waves, and the base flood elevation is 15 feet. So 15 feet at this particular site is going to end up being between about 9 feet above the ground. So this project made the decision through their design flood elevation to place the first floor at 12 feet above ground. So they added 3 feet of freeboard to their implementation of an elevation. So you've had a chance to look at this while I've been rambling. Hopefully you've come to some conclusion about whether or not this particular treatment maintain the character of this historic cottage or not. And just as a teaser, just about everybody that we've kind of shared this example with over a number of different workshops and presentations, probably 95% of people come to the conclusion that it did not maintain the historic character and would not meet the standards, even though this was never officially reviewed for that. So I'm going to take the next few slides to go through some of the guidance we have in the guidelines to talk about where you can kind of start to get an understanding of what may be acceptable and what may not be acceptable in terms of meeting the standards and maintaining the historic character. So starting on page 84, we're in the section that talks about elevating a historic building. And we have within the guidelines, these in kind of yellow headings, yellow bars with headings written in them. We have a section that specifically talks about the height of an elevation. And you can see in these kind of recommended and not recommended columns that we have a number of kind of elements called out about how to deal with choosing a height of elevation or evaluating what height you need to go to see whether or not you'll be able to maintain historic character. So looking at the second box under the not recommended column, we have designing a new foundation that is too tall so that its size and scale are out of proportion to the historic building and diminishing its character. So that starts to get to some of the kind of gut instincts that a lot of people have about this particular adaptation. Moving on to the next one. On page 86, we're still in a section that's talking about the height of the elevation. And if we look at the final box at the very bottom under not recommended, it says elevating a small scale or one-story building to a height approaching a full additional story. In this case, they went even higher, I think, than a full additional story or right at a full additional story. So using these examples that already existed helped us draft the guidelines that we're actually reading and helped us identify what are the pieces and parts when we break it apart that go into a project that on the whole will maintain the historic character or not.
Jenny, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to give you a 5-minute warning.
Oh gosh, we've gotten way late. Okay, thank you. So on page 91, I won't read through these, but we have a section that's on access. And in this particular case, access to the building was lost to a large degree through removal of the front steps. The front porch became really more of a balcony instead of your entry point. And then on page 95, looking at the site alterations, with this particular example, we end up with the front yard being dedicated not entirely, but mostly to a new driveway that did not exist before. And driveways can be accommodated if you're elevating to a point where it makes sense, but avoiding the front yard is kind of a key point here. So I did want to mention, and I think you're going to talk about this a lot in the next webinars. This is probably just a little teaser that all of these projects will require some level of review or permitting or approval. So it's really important, again, to make sure that you've documented the reasons that or kind of shown your work about establishing your flood risk level so that when folks are reviewing, okay, you're trying to solve for this flood risk and therefore you've chosen a particular adaptation, they'll understand the constraints that you're working under. And it just makes for a more collaborative process and folks can understand why you're making the decisions that you're making, even if it starts to push the envelope on being able to maintain historic character. It's a major goal, but sometimes we're pushing the envelope here. And then I think it's really important not to leave this out, but it's so important to make a treatment decision. We want to avoid the situation that you're seeing on the screen where we're getting to a really dire situation of a building about to fall off a cliff that's eroding from the river below it. Luckily, this building was saved. I can give you that good news, but make the decision, try not to prolong it, and don't get stuck in the endless cycle of study. We're never going to have all the information that we want about our risk or about our future projections. Do the best you can, document what you've got, but at some point you're going to have to make a decision and try not to drag that out too long. Once you've made the decision, again, a plan is only as good as it is once you implement it. The building won't be preserved. It won't gain resilience until you implement whatever adaptation you decide on. And then once you've adapted, your work unfortunately isn't quite over. You're going to need to continue to evaluate to make sure that the resiliency that you planned for is provided in reality. This picture that you see on the screen is one of the case studies at the end of the flood guidelines. So if you're interested in the specifics, they chose dry flood proofing, happened to have a flood within the first year or maybe two after they finished their adaptation project, and everything worked exactly as they planned, which is what we all hope for. So I rushed through the end just a little bit, but hopefully not too much. I see that we've got about, do we still have about 5 minutes for questions? I will let Alex make that determination.
Yes.
But you see a summary here on the screen of what we just kind of covered. Scratching the surface, I'm sorry, of some of it, but hopefully it gives you a good idea and some good tools to move forward. And I'll just flip over. If anyone wants to reach out to me directly, my email is on the screen. So Alex, I'm ready for questions if there are any.
Yes, this is Moira, but timekeeper
Oh,
Alex
sorry. Thanks,
has let me
Moira.
know that we do still have 5 minutes for questions. And I want to apologize. I saw some people come off mute during the second part of your presentation, and I don't know if that's because I ate up all the question time. So I'm going to hush. And if you do have questions and coming off mute was on purpose, please raise your hand or just come off mute, and we'd love to hear what you have to say.
This is Barbara Summers, and
Yeah,
we
Barbara,
have.
go ahead.
Oh, thank you. We have a historic building in Coopeville, Washington, and my question: you mentioned that elevating that with the upcoming Washington Trust monies that may be available, that relocating buildings would not be part of that. Does that apply to, are you lumping in elevation of the building into that same category?
I would not, but I'll defer to the folks with the Washington Trust to answer that one.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. So hi, Barbara. I think we've emailed a couple of times. I think I owe you an email. But I'm Moira, and I'm the Preservation Programs Director. For those of you who missed my intro, I'm developing the subgranting program. Elevation is an option. It is included in the Park Service guidance for compatible treatments. Some of what's going to happen with this first round of grants is the readiness to complete the project within the time frame because of the required regulatory reviews. It's considered a federal undertaking because of the source of the funding. All that to be said, if you can prove that you can get through all of the reviews and approvals required and get the work completed within the time frame, we're perfectly happy to look at elevating the building. There may be other constraints that dictate what kinds of projects can ultimately be funded. Does that make sense?
Right. No, it did. It makes sense. It's just when she mentioned that relocating is an extreme measure, which I agree with. I just wasn't sure whether you were lumping elevating in that same group.
Yeah, and if someone wants to apply with, again, a really compelling argument about how they can get it approved, but with the amount of money and the amount of time, it's so unlikely that we would be able to successfully fund and complete all the grant requirements for relocation that we're not really considering it a viable option.
Yeah, I'm not really considering relocating the building anyway.
We like you where you are.
Me too.
And Ryan, I see you are off mute.
Yeah, I just had a question that was spurred by that slide that showed the church on the bluff, because this is actually something here in state parks. We have more than one historic building on a bluff. But so this model showed sort of like the base elevation and the planned elevation or design. How does that correlate to a situation where you have bluff erosion as the major threat?
Yeah, so bluff erosion is its own, almost not entirely separate, but it is kind of a whole different category of risk that you're dealing with. The photograph that I showed is a location in Alaska, and that bluff had been eroding for something like, I think ever since a storm that hit in like 1978 or 79, and they'd been monitoring it very closely. So it really has to do with the rate of change, I would say, and
Right.
not all. uh, Now you're getting into needing geologists on your team, right? You need to
Right.
understand what are the dynamics of the soils, what continual pressure is being applied there. Is it stable? Is it not stable? So yeah, it's a whole different list of factors that you start to get into, but they're often interrelated. Shoreline erosion, bank erosion,
Right.
that is an element of flooding, but we don't get into the specifics of it in the flood guidelines. But I would say that's certainly part of your risk factor. And as you're making your determinations about what's an appropriate adaptation, absolutely that's part of the equation and should be factored in and communicated as you're making decisions about adaptation. Um, that
Uh,
those are the situations where you may be looking at relocation of the
Yeah.
building.
Yeah, we
That's just
certainly
about the
are.
only one.
Um,
Yeah.
and I was just curious if there's a correlating sort of guideline for when your back's against the wall like that. So, but thanks for answering the question.
Yeah, I think when it comes to that, it's so obvious to the eye, you don't need as much justification, honestly, if it's gotten that close. But in terms of documenting the risk, it really probably is the rate of change, how close is the bluff to the building, and that's about all you need.
Thanks.
Yep.
Be shy. I'm trying my best to stay on mute so people can ask their questions. All right, last call. Not last call. I put Jenny's email in the chat. Please feel free to reach out to her directly. Please feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my email in if you have questions about the upcoming grant program, although as Barbara can attest, my inbox runneth over. But I will share my screen again and give a very heartfelt and sincere thanks to Jenny for her time and expertise on this. Yes, a round of applause. As someone who is from southeastern Louisiana, on the very spooky 20th anniversary week of Hurricane Katrina, I'm so grateful that we're having these conversations with the hopes that people can be proactive rather than reactive. But you know, your levy is only as good as your care and maintenance for your levy. So back to this. After the webinar, you will receive a recording of the session as well as a link to the survey. The survey is very important. I want to emphasize this point. It's not just how'd you like it, how did we do, but we are really looking for your impressions about if, and you can choose to answer it after each individual webinar, or if you want to attend the whole series or both, up to you. But we're hoping to see if we're meeting the need of the community, right? Are we answering the kinds of questions and addressing the types of topics that you were hoping to learn more about? Is there something that we've missed or something that's still not making sense, something that would be really useful to you or your community? The feedback that we receive as through the survey responses are going to really help to shape and guide us while we're coming up with the additional resources that will be the resource guide. So please do take a few minutes to answer that. And please, if you're interested, register for the next sessions. We've got two more, and Jenny did a great teaser for us about getting your permits and assembling your team. So each of these feeds one into the other. But another moment and maybe a brief round of applause for Miss Jenny Parker from the National Park Service. Thank you so much.